All right, it's my pleasure to announce our second lecture by Beti Žerovc from the University of Ljubljana. Beti is an art historian and theorist. I invited her for a couple of reasons. I was in Ljubljana a year and a half ago, almost. And we, for a lecture, and we walked through the city quite a bit and discussed issues of monuments and the power of sites. And of course, in urban space, in respect to monuments, I think it's fair to say that the group that is in power also has the power to make a mark in public space, such as a monument. Now, in Ljubljana or under particular political regimes, these powers would always also be very particular. And so Beti is today looking at the famous or almost infamous, I think, high-modernist monuments in Yugoslavia that we have all come to love so much. However, she will take like a different turn on them, and I already love the title that she has put forward here. Can the high modernism of Yugoslav monuments be viewed as a Trojan horse of capitalism in socialism, ? I think there was a book that just came out and is now in translation. Is that true? Is it in English already? Yeah. Okay, so there's a book also to be noted and maybe bought in the near future on on monuments that Beti researched in the last couple of years. And so please help me welcome Beti Žerovc to Vienna.
Hello, and Mikkel, thank you for inviting me. Yes, the territory of Yugoslavia is the home to a really fascinating collection of high modernist monuments, and those monuments are really attracting a lot of attention in the past decade or a little bit more. They were made after the Second World War, more or less mostly in 60s and 70s, and they are dedicated to the revolution, to Second World War, to events, personalities in the Second World War. It's not okay? Is now better? Yeah. Yeah? Okay, super. Yeah, they're dedicated to the revolution and the events in the Second World War, and also they were there to reinforce the ideas and the principles of the socialist system of Yugoslavia. Today, they really provoke a very, very wide range of responses. You know, from really loathing, rage, they are very often also destroyed, to, on the other side, to really unmitigated enthusiasm. Today, you know, they're very often just taken as some kind of hollow structures which are used for all kinds of purposes, like, you know, for films, music videos, where they're just like a scenery. Here I picked an Austrian example, the band Olympique, which in 2014 made a video, The Reason I Came, which is all you know, the monuments of Yugoslavia, the most exponent ones are just like a scenery for this video. So yeah, in music, in films, the use is very often of those monuments, but on the other side, you have also a lot of presentations of those monuments in art institutions now all around the world. This is the latest example that happened in MoMA. Very often, they are used also for very commercial purposes, you know, for all kinds of fashion shootings in glossy magazines and so on. And this happened quite recently and stirred quite a response because, you know, this is a very famous monument of Bogdan Bogdanović in Jasenovac. It's a monument to concentration camp and its victims. and it's really weird to use it as a commercial for eyeglasses. I would agree to that. Maybe I shouldn't put this onto the one slide, but I decided to do so because the aesthetic that is applied on those monuments is usually the same, no matter if they're used for commercials or if they're used whatever, by MoMA or some other art institution. You know, this gloomy, unearthly, they looked somehow weird. Okay, so this is the question that I would like to tackle. Some parts of the text I will put like this, so maybe you will understand me better. My English is not perfect. So, even among the people who really like those monuments, you know, they somehow are provoking some kind of embarrassment, confusion, puzzlement. And I think that this probably comes, you know, from the lack of clarity about them, because we don't know so much about them. But also because, you know, people feel them somehow inconsistent or incompatible with what they are supposed to represent, or with the community, the socialist community that erected them. But, you know, it's difficult to say why exactly do we feel this way. So here today we will try to tackle this question. We see the monuments as powerful, high quality, high modern artworks, but at the time they were made, high modernist art was typically associated with the capitalist West. Such art is even seen as a weapon used by the West during the Cold War, not as something that could be cultivated at a high level, and in the Balkans, of all places, by grey, undernourished, community-focused socialism, where supposedly there was little freedom, which, like oxygen, was considered essential for creating powerful, high-quality, high-modernist art. Okay. So already, if I pose this question, and this question is very often posed, you know, people are asking me exactly this question again and again, is full of myths about the West, myths about the East, myths that are coming from the field of art, where we have specific ideas how art should be made, what kind of freedom it needs. And that then made me decide that I will speak about those monuments through the myths and the stereotypes that I find are often, you know, somehow making a cocoon around this phenomenon. This will be myths from the East, from the West, from now, from before. They will not be somehow connected, but just the myths which are somehow, let's say, close to this phenomenon, are somehow you know, building an idea about them. I think that here I have to say also one thing that is maybe people are not thinking so much about it. Now, those monuments are very often written about and interpreted in art or contemporary art milieu, or also in kind of glossy design, hipster, whatever magazines. And then the mythology and the stereotypes of those two realms, you know, of art and this contemporary trendy culture, are then applied to those monuments. And then this makes really kind of a very dense cocoon. So I will be telling about these myths, and through this story about the myths, I hope you will get a story. You will get a story about the monuments. Here is just one of the examples how people write about those monuments, and usually, you know, you can sense a very, very strong orientalization or orientalistic approach. Here you have something that was written in a magazine you probably know, the Zine, by somebody who is a known, heralded writer, but you know, the story is, you know, written in a way that it's, I mean, really, really weird. You know, he is writing about a photographer who was photographing all kinds of buildings and objects in ex-East, not in Soviet Union, but in 2014 in the countries which were then already all in the European Union. But as you see, you know, it is written like, you know, the artist would be traveling somewhere that would be very dangerous, some horrible places. But you know, some of them are from Croatia. Croatia, you know, where you go for the weekend, to Istria. So if you see somebody in the bushes, now you know who it is. Okay, I shouldn't joke like that. Okay, yeah. Okay, so first, the myth of the wild Balkans. If we speak about this production, you know, if you're a little bit familiar of how such a production of huge monuments is made, it is very clear, you know, that you need a very strong supportive structure. You need a lot of specialized knowledge. You need regular commissions. And, you know, if you pretend that they just fell from the sky to the Balkans, again, you're deeply in the realm of myth. Another thing that it's very, very rarely allowed into discussion about these monuments is that we had a very good tradition in Yugoslavia of building public monuments, and also, you know, hundreds and millennia of years of very good art that exists on this territory. So, you know, just very shortly, I will try to explain a little bit this tradition. Yeah. Yugoslavia is formed in 1918 from, you know, two very different parts. One comes mostly from Austria-Hungary, the other from Ottoman, was Ottoman before. When it is formed, is this really a very poor, very asymmetrically developed conservative monarchy. Very little schools are there for art, but the ones they formed are immediately of a very, very good quality. And here I would like to mention just two of them. One is Zagreb Visual Art Academy, which was led by Ivan Meštrović, the famous sculptor, and the other one is Ljubljana Architectural School, where Jože Plečnik was working. So in Zagreb, they built a very strong production of figurative monuments, which then, after the Second World War, you know, just went into these realist, socialist, realist monuments. Ljubljana School of Architecture, also Belgrade, you know, they made very good architectural monuments, and those were then the monuments which led in the production of Bogdan Bogdanović, you've seen the Jasenovec, or Edvard Ravnikar made beautiful monuments. You will see some more architectural monuments. What I should also say is that Yugoslav architects, before the Second World War, they were really fond of modernism. Let's say many of them were, for example, assistants in Le Corbusier's atelier. You know, just some photos, so you will believe me. Meštrović, a big hit in Vienna Secession, Vidovdan Temple. This is, you know, kind of Yugoslav mythology before Yugoslavia in stone. A typical Meštrović monument before, then in between the wars at Avala in Belgrade. Or these are the things, you know, that were then done in the Zagreb school. The sculptures for Chicago, the Bowman, the Spearman, he's working together with students. And these are just two examples of what was then done later by his most prominent student, Antun Augustinčić. Also an example from New York, but you know, this type of work was something that was very typical for this period of socialist Yugoslavia. Plečnik, you probably know. You know, the Church of Holy Spirit, really something very, you know, it shows that we have in Plečnik somebody who understands really well how to be monumental and how to speak through monumental forms, but also how to speak through very elegant forms. This is one of the very nice monuments in Lani, in Czech Republic, where you can see that he's commemorating the fallen in the First War, just with a very tiny, very elegant granite spire. And this is then his students, also an assistant then to Le Corbusier, Edvard Ravnikar, with a really beautiful monument and cemetery at the site of concentration camp in Rab, that is an island in Croatia. Yeah, and this is already Bitola, Macedonia. Another thing that should be mentioned is that on the space, on the territory of Yugoslavia, you really had a huge tradition of art from before, a lot of antiquity. You know, in Split, still now people live in a Roman, in Diocletian palace, and also, you know, then later things like, you know, this is Strogar Cathedral, beautiful medieval art, beautiful early Renaissance, and a great knowledge of elaborating stone. So that is also one of the aspects that should be mentioned. But what is also very important, that the builders of monuments of Yugoslavia, they were not only, you know, in this Western type of commemoration, which is very object-based, but they had to deal also with the Orthodox tradition of commemoration or Ottoman tradition of commemoration. And they're different. They're less object-oriented. They don't allow such a strong cult of personality. So, you know, you had to deal with all this. And all those things, you know, made them to think about monuments as really highly demanding intellectual, conceptual works. You know, you couldn't do there a monument very simply as you could do it, let's say, in, I don't know, France. You have one nation, one religion. But, you know, this is something that already existed a little bit in Austro-Hungary, because you also have this multi-religiosity and multi-ethnicity. Another thing that I will tackle as a myth is the myth of the wild and uneducated socialist leaders and very closed borders of the East and Yugoslavia. This is now very long, but I will try to cut it short. Usually, you know, the leaders of a socialist new country are presented as, you know, kind of peasant who have seen shoes for the first time, but the thing is not like that. The Yugoslav government really had a lot of people which were very well educated, very sophisticated, and who really knew a lot about art. And it's actually them, and I think there's a soft spot for this type of creation, which has a very strong individuality, very strong demand for freedom for the artist. It's this matrix. This matrix could somehow survive exactly because of them. So again, I will give you some examples. This is a very high politician, he's Slovene, Boris Kidric, and he was a son of our most prominent expert at the time on the most important Slovene poet, the Romantic France Prešeren. So I'm sure that his son knew something about art, and maybe because of that, he was such a famous ardent speaker. You know, he really knew what means the power of the word. Or another example, Koča Popović. Koča Popović was a surrealist artist, philosopher, poet, film critic, who decided not to work in the realm of art anymore because he saw that the political problems are really, really demanding, and art simply doesn't have the potential to tackle with them. So, you know, he turned away from art. So from the artist, he became a very famous warrior, first in the Spain War, then in Yugoslavia, where he was the most important person in our most glorified battle, at the battle in Sutjeska. Also then he was the liberator of Belgrade and so on. So this surrealist artist, from there to the commander, after that he was one of the most important politicians in Yugoslavia. At the end, it was also meant that he will replace Tito. Among other, he was also our ambassador to United Nations. But I don't know if at the same time as Kurt Waldheim, who was also a warrior in Bosnia. Yeah. And another example, the last example, Moshe Piade, a very famous painter before the Second World War, who also then turned, he was imprisoned for a long time for being a communist, also there when he was quite old, still a partisan warrior. And you know, I added some stamps or monuments so that you would see that those were really important politicians that I'm not imagining. You know, if you're getting big monuments or stamps, you have to be really important. Okay, so what I'm trying to see is that that maybe those leaders, also because they didn't have time, didn't vocally defend contemporary art, but they didn't show enough of the oppression, you know, that this would stop its development. And also we have to know that the socialist realism, which was very present in Yugoslavia, was not there because they would not know about art, but because of the pragmatism. If people don't understand monuments, you have a problem. So they were trying, you know, at least for some time, to give what is needed, and that is figurative monument. But on the other side, what has to be said is that also from the late 40s on, Western contemporary art was regularly presented in Yugoslavia, and Yugoslav artists, art historians, architects were all traveling on stipends to the West from late 40s on, and not 1 or 3 per year, but dozens per year. So borders were not so closed as is usually imagined. Those things were not happening against those leaders, but with their consent. And you didn't have to smuggle abstract art or something to Yugoslavia, but you were sent to the West to study it there. Okay. But you will see through the exhibitions that maybe it sounds weird, but you will see later that it is so. Okay. Now we go to two myths which seem somehow opposing each other. The myth of modernism as a poor and non-political art, and the modernism as practical and political form of art. I don't know how to explain that very quickly, but if Jackson Pollock is doing art, is that pure and non-political because it comes from his soul, from his hand, yes? When CIA uses this art to show around the world what huge amount of freedom people have in America, then that is very practical and political form of art. And you know, these twists with modern art were happening everywhere. Okay, so what I wanted to show here, that a positive attitude towards contemporary art and towards high modernism could not have established itself in Yugoslavia had it not been in line with some of the country's internal political needs, or at least if there had been no myth that it was in line with them. For one thing, in a country weighed down by nationalism, the abstract, incomprehensible language of modernism was supposed to help erase the differences between the republics. You know, the nationalism in Yugoslavia was always there, so they tried to do everything, you know, to somehow lower it down. For another, as none of the republics had yet claimed modernism as its own, this style of art could represent the shared values based on the ideas of brotherhood and unity, while at the same time also representing Yugoslavia's modernity and developmental focus. And this could be something, you know, that was also good to persuade the people who were not supporters of modernism. You know, they said, okay, we don't like it, but if it has positive effects, it's fine. So another similar factor was Yugoslavia's political effort to move closer to the capitalist West, in which the West, you know, culturally colonized the Yugoslavs, but they, because of their own needs, they consented to that. You know, they somehow said, okay, let's do it. It seems that they somehow have seen through those gifts, you know, coming from the West and from the Americans. We really had a huge amount of exhibitions from the West touring in Yugoslavia. But obviously, they haven't seen through this clearly enough that they would see that as something that could be a real problem. So Yugoslavia's cultural institutions thus revered, you know, this Western type of art in the illusory hope that by doing so, they were not also revering the art system that produced those artworks, which was, of course, from the socialist perspective, very, very problematic, very individualistic, a lot of money, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Here I am trying to show you some photos that would make clear that really we had a lot of exhibitions going on in Yugoslavia at the time. I picked only some of them. For example, I picked Moore because he was kind of important for our figurative monuments. You know, in the mid-50s, they kind of really changed from socialist realism to more modern forms. Or, you know, this is every 2 years we had a huge exhibition of American art touring. Here you can see the one that was touring in '61 in Yugoslavia. You see Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana in '61 with a huge American flag. Today this could not happen. People would really object. Then obviously that was possible. Here you can see this exhibition. And also, you see, this is the most important biennial of ex-Yugoslavia, the graphic biennial in Ljubljana. If you read a little bit who was in the committee, you know, that's really amazing. Bill Lieberman from MoMA, Koszatzki, director of Albertina, Umbro Apollonio, director of Venice Biennial, and so on and on. That were the committees of the biennial. So it is not so weird that already in the '63, Robert Rauschenberg got the first award. That's before he got the award in the Venice Biennial. Yeah. So Tito was also regularly visiting those biennials and was shown around. The media reported about that. But you know, he was really like Franz Josef. It was nice. I enjoyed it. Goodbye. He was very clear that he doesn't like contemporary art, and you know that in this exchange he's interested in America's wheat or America's credit or something like that. Okay, so if we go now further, this is a myth that was built by the country, by the state of Yugoslavia about the world unity and brotherhood. And then you have a myth that I think it's a myth that originates in the art world. How good art cannot originate as official art, or at least not as art of some systems, political systems that we don't like so much. Okay, so Yugoslav socialism did not develop its own distinctive style of art, but rather a variant that was different from Eastern art, mostly in the fact that it was without an art market. In its development, this art was to a large degree free. Its reception was not significantly different from that in similarly peripheral regions of Europe. Small town in Slovenia like Kranj would have a similar reception as small town in Austria, Klagenfurt in the 60s. That's it, not much different. But it lacked also the mediation of an art market and the glamour and allure that comes only with dizzying prices and the involvement of wealthy buyers. This last part of the sentence is something that makes contemporary art sexy in a way, but also, you know, art does a lot of meditation of contemporary art towards the society. In Yugoslavia, because we didn't have this part, you know, contemporary art was somehow floating. You couldn't really know to whom it was intended. Okay. But by contrast, socialism aptly supported and developed contemporary art when it needed it, which led to the establishment of modernism even in such works as large public monuments. In Yugoslavia, in keeping with the importance ascribed to these works and the absence of any art market, the monuments were created by the country's top artists and architects. And over time, those people could somehow build for themselves a very largely autonomous field of operations, which, among others, they regulated through a great number of competitions. Through those competitions, you know, they were really having very strong debates. And also through those competitions, they could give monetary awards to very good, very strong, very contemporary proposals for monuments. You know, some of these competitions are really, when you're going through the materials, they're super great. And that is how, you know, they were building a really strong and very contemporary field for building of monuments. But it is a fact then, in the field of monuments, then really extraordinary and great monuments were built, but it is also true that formally, in their visual expression, they were somehow more and more cut from the society. Also, you know, that was happening in the 60s and in the 70s. So those monuments were not there to alleviate the pain of those who have lost a loved one in the Second World War, but they were more and more there only to reinforce the state ideology. But this state ideology was less and less liked by the people of Yugoslavia. You know, they didn't want anymore this, how is it called, brotherhood and unity. They would want, you know, they didn't want to have one-party system anymore. They wanted to somehow go closer to the capitalism. So, you know, those monuments represented something that somehow they less and less liked. So what is interesting, that in the heyday of these modernist monuments, when they were built, they were already then built on the myths or on the topics which, you know, were, yeah, let's say myths, which were somehow declining, which were already dead, which were not really liked. But you know, their builders, they were somehow not so much interested in that. They were more and more interested in building, you know, really a very strong individual artwork. What is interesting that, you know, they built this and they were not interested in anything really beside that. So what was usually quite weird is that you had these futuristic forms. This is Dusan Jamunja's monument in Kozara, also in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then the rituals which were next to those futuristic forms were very simple, usually, you know, kind of folk dances, poems were recited, and so on. So, you know, this combination then maybe made this ideology, you know, even more hollow. It was seen that it's somehow something wrong with it. You know, then the partisan veteran associations, they sometimes really tried, you know, to make those monuments closer to the people. And this is one of really sweet tries. They make a sticker album for children where they would collect stickers of monuments to revolution. I mean, yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, so if we go now back here to different bits. So at certain point is the problem, you know, did we really have this situation where we had the idea that in the West everything is beautiful and right, and in socialism everything is really bad and wrong. You know, I think the final blow socialism got from the ideological apparatus of the West, you know, from these shiny appearances that we got through the films and, you know, all these things like Mercedeses or Levi's or well-developed art market were really beautiful and people were really, you know, kind of yearning for them. So, you know, I'm born in the very beginning of 70s, and I have this memory how we had a completely decent country with very many qualities, but everything I heard at home or I don't know where about it, it was just that everything is so wrong. It's so wrong, and that something has really to change. Another memory that is important for me is that I had a grandmother, a very simple, very, very poor peasant woman, very poor before the Second World War, who could cherish, you know, the goods that were brought by the system because she could offer, you know, a completely different childhood to her children than she had herself. But my wealthier, middle-class part of the family, you know, they could not see, I mean, they could not see, you know, the even greater freedoms, the growing social equality, the constantly growing, improving position of women, which was really great in Yugoslavia. You know, they seemed for this somehow completely blind. So I have 10 points. don't worry, I will finish soon. So I'm coming to the myth of our monuments. So if we may exaggerate a little, those monuments already at the time when they were built, they didn't belong to anyone. They could not belong to my grandmother or to partisan associations of veterans and similar, because they didn't have, you know, the modernist code. They didn't possess it to understand them and to be affiliated with them, okay? And of course, those partisan veterans associations, if they could move those, they could change those modernist proposals of monuments for something else, they also did that. So very often, you know, you would have proposals like this, and then what was built was this. This is also now presented in MoMA. This should be built in Kran. It's not far from Austria, in Slovenia, and it should be like this, in the middle of a square, a huge concrete tree. That was meant to be built in '54, but then the veteran partisan associations, you know, they somehow were successful in building something else. Okay, the monuments didn't belong to this part. They also didn't belong to the well-educated, because, you know, somehow they only wanted to leave this state ideology of Yugoslavia behind, and those monuments were representing that bad part of Yugoslavia to them, no matter if they were socialist, realist, or modernist. What is interesting, that somehow they obviously also didn't belong to their authors, to their builders, because later they were building same kind of monuments for the other, ideologically other side, and also they even don't object if their hyper-modernist structures are nowadays removed. Another thing that is interesting is this, that we rarely reflect on the gulf between what today are seen as the two pinnacles of art in socialist Yugoslavia, the modernist monuments and the conceptual art produced by younger artists, the generation born mainly in 1940s and 50s, who utterly rejected these same monuments as official art and denounced their creators as men who had sold their souls. So, you know, now you have everywhere. You have Marina Abramovic and you have such a monument, but there's no explanation, you know, that there was a deep hatred between those two types of art at the time. It is difficult to believe, these our monuments, that until recently these monuments were largely unnoticed and unpopular. You know, they were there, you know, like they would be trying to be very shy so nothing would happen to them. And it was only when this heritage was threatened with destruction that some weak interest appeared in socialist monuments in general, modernist and the socialist realists, with a somehow stronger interest specifically in the high modernist monuments appearing only when the West discovered this body of work. This might well sound strange, since it shatters yet another myth, this one about us, for example, researchers or experts on art. The myth that we ex-Yugoslavs are today the monument's noble guardians against Western Orientalization. You know, usually the discourse in Yugoslavia would be, oh, they're presented in such a wrong way in the West. Okay, I agree, that might be true. But you know, if this West would show no interest, maybe we would not take care about these monuments at all, even now. So this is my final point. The myth of the revolutionary potential in these monuments, because people, quite often they believe that they possess it somehow per se in their form or whatever. So, yeah. So at the end, you know, I wonder if all this really happened like this, as I presented it, at least approximately. But if it did, then I am really unsure why there is such enthusiasm for those monuments, because, you know, they, as monuments, they were unsuccessful. The system that they were backing just failed. So I would like to believe, you know, that there is revolutionary potential in them, somewhere directly in them. But I fear that that is also just some kind of myth. And what excites us now so much by these monuments, you know, are just simple forms which are emptied of this socialist ideology, and the art mythology is somehow swelling inside of them. This mythology, which is centered on completely different values that socialism has, and that is individualism and so on. So, you know, I really don't know, can they today at all speak to us in some other than our desire, you know, for novelty, for Instagram, visual stimuli, and so on. I'm not sure. And I don't know what also such kind of presentations as is now in MoMA, what do they really mean? You know, are they really building a better knowledge about them and that will change something? Are they some kind of activism that is approving socialism as a kind of system with a lot of potentiality, which approving of its art, which I doubt? You know, or are those forms, those huge forms, which are presented almost without any context, just kind of Trojan horses, which are coming home after decades of serving far away, and they're somehow, you know, getting the laurels, they're crowned with laurels that they deserve. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry that I was a bit too long.
Thank you so much. Beti will close the one. He will exit, but still we have, if there are any immediate questions, we are happy to discuss them. Yes.
Thank you. This is so interesting. I'm really interested in the different historical mediations your talk is bringing up. And there's one term in particular that seemed to me to fit in, but that you didn't use, and that's the sort of discourse surrounding the counter-monument, which fuels the 1990s art historical sort of attention to monumental forms of previous decades. And I'm wondering if there isn't something about these modernist monuments you're looking at that doesn't anticipate or intersect with these counter-monumental forms that kind of fill in, like you were saying, the swelling of the artistic and aesthetic value of these sculptures towards the turn of the 21st century. Is there something about them that might be conceivable to speak of in terms of counter-monumentality?
Actually, it's like that, you know, one of the problems that we have now is that the production of monuments in Yugoslavia was really huge. Most of them were really very, very simple. Then a big part was these socialist realist monuments. But then you had also a part with this modernist monuments, or then in the 80s also postmodern if you want. And you know, in this production, you may find a lot of monuments which are, yeah, kind of counter-monument before counter-monuments. And actually, in the book that I'm preparing, I have another co-editor. We will write it partly, and also some other people will write. We have actually a chapter now which is dealing with this. Because, you know, already in the 50s in Yugoslavia, you have, you know, dealing with empty spaces instead of form, or, you know, the commemorative ritual, which was usually really the dramaturgy of monuments is sometimes so precise, and it really wants you to do something, you know, through your movement and so on. So yeah, that is of course something that is very present in this practice. It was just, it is something that just didn't go with my, yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes?
Thank you very much for the beautiful lecture, and especially for promoting the Yugoslav thing. Yes, it's something that we from the Eastern Europe are doing on a daily basis. You know, try to talk about people such as Kocha Popovic that you mentioned, and I would have liked if you mentioned that he was actually a close collaborator of Andre Breton, and that there's been even more people who are very prominent politicians in Yugoslavia who were actually top players, I would say, in European cultural arena. But my question would be, could we actually talk about these monuments being a Trojan horse of capitalism, when we know that first Yugoslavia was quite open, it was not an Iron Curtain scenario, and let's say that we had jazz, we had abstract expressionism, which was in fact the CIA cultural politics scenario, as you mentioned. But we had all these events back in the 50s, starting from 50s and in the 60s, and then there is a long story of relations between U.S. and Yugoslavia. I would say it's 100 years of love and hatred and intertwined. And lastly, the inspiration for these monuments did not come exclusively from the West, but from the East as well. When you think about some monuments of the 60s, they're also very esoteric in their appearance and in their inspiration that it's drawn upon. And also, I mean, when you think about modernist practices, they are not very much in tune with, I would say, neoliberal or capitalistic doctrine. So I mean, it's just an open question that you posed yourself. But when you take
long
this
question. You know, actually, you know, I brought those people in, like Kocha Popovic or Moshe Piade or Boris Kidric, because, you know, one of the things that I find really important that is behind that those monuments could happen at all is this idea of an artist which was in Yugoslavia a bit different than in other Eastern European countries. You know, we stayed with this, let's say, bourgeois idea of artists, who is a very strong individual, who has to be free to do great things. And that was something that was very important, and that was something that allowed those people to do things the way they did it. And if you know, if the politics, you know, in the first years after the war, if they would decide differently, we would have another concept of art and another concept of doing art and of being artists. But actually, because they left this somehow through, because obviously they have some soft spot of it or whatever, I don't know, you know, then such type of production could happen at all. But you know, if you have such type of production, and if you cherish this idea of artists as very strong entrepreneur, individual and so on, this is an idea that is very, very close to the idea also of capitalist entrepreneur. So, you know, then these ideas are swelling. You know, people like them, they want them more and more. And that's why I think those things could be Trojan horses. And I also think, you know, that the form is not just speaking for herself. You know, those monuments, if we are declaring them as socialist monuments, which were built for the revolution, and, you know, for the moments which stand for socialism, they will stay like that. But now that is not happening. Now they're usually declared as a mere art, né? and more they are somehow connected with their individual creators. That was never happening before. But now if you go to MoMA, you have, you know, rooms of Bogdanović, of Ravnikar, you know, so they're somehow forced a little bit into a classical canon of art, okay? But if you're doing that, you're losing this other part, which I think is very important. I don't think there is per se something revolutionary in those forms. Was it? Did I answer?
Yeah.
There's a long break. Is there another question?
Just shortly, also in relation to this.
Yep.
Was Bakić and Bogdanović.
What? Sorry, I didn't understand.
Bakić, Bogdanović, all these artists at the time. I mean, I read recently this introduction by Galkin about them, and Bogdanović he was a partisan fan, but he was later on not a big fan of the state of Yugoslavia. What I'm asking here is what I understood.
No.
Yeah.
He was not a big fan of the regime of Milosevic.
No. Also later he broke with Tito.
In later years,
yes,
but that was
exactly.
already.
What drove him, despite of that, what drove both of them is their artistic practice, and they, as it said in this introduction, they had a free hand in the production of these monuments, and there was also the saying that there's no state involvement, interference in the aesthetics of these monuments. So, and here, because I saw some contradictions here, that's the case? Because I think they were above all on this, in their own work, like interested in this production of their monuments, and the rest was secondary.
Again, I don't understand very well. There are probably a lot of contradictions in what I'm saying, but you have to understand this is a terribly difficult topic, because, you know, everything that you're trying to put together is somehow wrong, doesn't go together, and you really have problems to build a narrative that you could tell in half an hour. So please excuse me for any such things. The thing is that people like architects or very important artists or people who were for Yugoslavia very, very important, and they behaved like them towards them. So if somebody was really an expert like Bogdanović, you know, they would say, you know what you're doing, do a monument the way you want it. And that's how we got monuments of Bogdanović, which are really amazing and great. And also, you know, I was mentioning those commissions. In those commissions, you know, you have then all kinds of architects and artists discussing those monuments. And when people like Bogdanović and Ravnikar and all these people discuss, I mean, that is really very, very high niveau. You know, what is really weird is that people were always thinking that the state was telling what art should do in Yugoslavia. But now, when we're going through archives, nothing less that was happening at all. You know, usually only local organizations like local partisan veteran association, you know, would try to remove some monument, but in larger projects, nothing like that was happening. You know that something like that, what called it in Germany, you know, with Neue Wache and Kette Kollwitz, would happen in Yugoslavia. No, it didn't. It didn't.
That's what I mean. That sounds super progressive from today's perspective, also in the context of the time, to all other nations, also in the context of, because you wrote the third way, and then I thought it's maybe the non-aligned movement, but you don't refer to that.
No, I don't refer to that. You know, you have to know that maybe it sounds hyper-progressive, but as you can see, with this hyper-progressiveness, they allowed something that maybe then led to the decline of our system. So I don't know really if I would say that this super progressiveness was okay for us. It would be okay maybe if MoMA would do this exhibition 50 years ago. You know, then we would know in Yugoslavia, oh, maybe we have something that is good. But if it's done now, that is something completely different. I lost. Okay, sorry.
But we had a round table, I think. Are there any more questions? All right, so we will start again at 5 o'clock. There's an exhibition downstairs. There is, I think, another announcement.